All right, so in this lesson, we're going to go ahead and figure out, given 2 points, how to write the function. And so you really have to have this down from the last lesson. You have to remember sine starts on the midline, then goes to the maximum or minimum. So they're going to give us the first quarter. They're going to give us, I think in most of these, the first quarter. They may give us the first half. I'll have to take a look at the examples I have. Cosine starts on the max or the min and then goes to the midline. So taking that information, can we figure out what the amplitude is? In other words, the distance from the max to the midline. Can we figure out where the midline's located? All that stuff, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do in this lesson. So let's look at these 2 points. So we're starting on the midline. So that tells us, since this is the start, that indicates that we're dealing with sine. So if I were to plot this point on a coordinate plane, we're starting at 0, -3. So that's our start. And that's the midline. So we know that this is the midline, which tells us that d is -3. So we can already come up with at the end of our equation. It's going to be -3 on the outside, right? Let's go ahead and figure out, is it positive or negative in front of our sine? So we're going to have some sine function, sine of something, and we know there's a -3 at the end. We know it's a positive because it's going to the maximum next. So it's going to be positive. If it's going to the minimum next, then that means we'd be going down here, creating a negative sine graph. But it's going up to the maximum next, so that's going to be a positive graph. So let's figure out, where's this maximum located, and that's located at 2 and -1.5, kind of interestingly, right there, right in the middle. So that point is 2 and -1.5. So what's the distance, that vertical distance from there? So there's our first quarter. But what's that vertical distance there? Well, let's just do the top minus the bottom. -1.5 minus -3. Look at those minus signs. 1.5 plus 3. Oh, -1.5 plus 3. I was like, man, that does not make sense. Which is 1.5. It's just the distance there. However you figure that out, I mean, you could just look at it and see that, right? Okay, so 1.5, we figured out our amplitude. We figured out the number going in front here. We determined that it was a positive sign because going up instead of down. So what about the period? We need to figure out not just what the period is, but what b is. So let's start with the period. So if this is a quarter of the way, a quarter of the period equals, what's that distance from 0 to 2? It equals 2. So that means we multiply the 4 and we get 8. So our period's 8. That makes sense. If a quarter of it's 2, then the whole thing's going to be 8, right? Now, remember, that's not what b is. 8's not what it's going to go in front of here because we need to figure out what b is. 2 pi over b is 8. All right, so let's solve for b. So I'll multiply b to the other side. So 8b, or 2 pi equals 8b. Divide by 8 to get pi over 4. And that's what's going to go right here in front of x. Let's do another one. So this time we're starting with the max and then the midline. So that's going to be cosine. Positive cosine because it starts at the max. So you notice because we're start at the maximum, that tells us we're using cosine. So let's go ahead and start with that point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. just to get a picture real quick. Then we're going, so that's 0, 7. And then we're going to the midline at 3, 3. So our graph is doing like this, right? That's our first quarter of the graph. Remember? So our midline, equation of the midline, going right through 3. So if we can already start, we know it's cosine. And then we know our equation is going to be 3 because it's getting shifted up 3, right? That's the midline. You look at the y-coordinate for the midline. And then the amplitude, 7, that's the distance from the max to the midline is 4, right? From 7 to 3, it's going to be 4. So now let's just figure out our period. So a quarter of our graph is from 0 to 3. So a quarter of it is 3. So our period, if we multiply the 4, is 12. So 2 pi over b equals 12. So 12b equals 2 pi. So b equals pi over 6. There we go. Okay, this one's a little bit different. Same idea, but you got to pay attention to what you're given. And I'm going to draw the picture. So we're starting with the maximum. So since we're starting the maximum, once again, that's going to be cosine. That's our start. It's going to be cosine. But they're giving us instead the minimum, not the midpoint. So if let's go back up to this, what we did a while back. So starting at the maximum, coming to the midline, that's a quarter of the graph. But then we go down, they're giving us the maximum and the minimum. So they're going to go through 2 quarters of the graph. So actually it's a half of the graph that we're given there. And where does that make a difference right here? Remember when we figured out a quarter of the graph? So we did a quarter of the period's 3. That's when it makes a difference on this problem. So you got to pay attention to what's given here. This one's kind of the wild card. So 0, 5. That's our start, and then our minimum is at 2 pi. Negative 5. So one thing we have to figure out is our midline, actually. So the midline is going to be the average of the max and the min. It's the middle of the max and the min. So if I do 5 plus negative 5 over 2, it's going to give me 0 over 2, which is 0. So that's our midline. So that's what you would do. If you're given the max and the min, you're just going to add them up and divide by 2 to get the midline, the middle value, right? And we know we're rolling with cosine. Positive cosine because we're starting on the maximum. If we're starting on the minimum, it would be negative cosine. And plus 0, we don't really need to include it. Okay, what's our amplitude? Well, if our midline is right here is 0, then our amplitude is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the distance to the max from the midline, right? Now this 2 pi, our period, half of our period, because this is half of the graph, right? So this is the first half. We just need the second half. So half of our period is 2 pi. Actually, I was doing this in red earlier. Let me stay consistent. So then multiply it 2. So our whole period is 4 pi. So what is b going to be? Divide by the 4 pi, b equals 1/2. So that's what's going to go in front of x. And there's our equation.